The desert wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain across the makeshift camp where three worlds collided in the shadow of the Chiricahua Mountains. It was 1882, and the Apache Wars had painted the Arizona Territory in blood and broken promises. Yet here, in this unlikely gathering, a moment of profound choice would unfold that would challenge every assumption about love, loyalty, and the true measure of a man's strength. Thomas McKenna sat apart from the others, his weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of bitter coffee. At 34, he carried the lean frame of a man who had spent half his life in the saddle and the other half learning that survival meant more than just staying alive. His blue eyes, faded like old denim, held the weight of 1,000 sunsets and twice as many regrets. The other cowboys avoided him, not out of fear, but out of that peculiar discomfort men feel around someone who has walked through hell and emerged changed. He had not always been this way. Once, he had been the kind of man who laughed easily and trusted quickly. That was before the Comanche raid that took his family when he was barely 21. Before he learned that weakness was a luxury the frontier did not permit. Before he discovered that the only way to survive losing everything was to become nothing that could be taken away. The transformation had been deliberate and brutal. He had stripped himself of sentiment, of hope, of any attachment that might serve as a weapon against him in the hands of fate. He spoke little, trusted less, and had built around his heart a fortress of indifference that had served him well for 13 years. He was known throughout the territory as a man you could hire but never own, respect but never befriend, depend on but never understand. The Apache called him Ghost Walker, though he never knew why until this day. Across the camp, the negotiations continued with the tedious formality that marked all attempts at peace between the Apache and the white settlers. Colonel James Morrison, resplendent in his Union blue despite the war having ended 17 years past, represented the territorial government. His aide, a nervous young lieutenant who jumped at every shadow, scribbled notes with the dedication of a man who believed paperwork could solve what bullets had failed to accomplish. Opposite them sat War Chief Cochise's son, Nate, his face carved from the same stone as the mountains that had sheltered his people for generations. Beside him, the medicine man Geronimo's weathered features revealed nothing of his thoughts, though his dark eyes missed no detail of the white men's discomfort. They had come under a flag of truce to discuss the impossible, terms for peace in a land where peace had become as foreign as mercy. But it was the third figure who drew McKenna's unwilling attention. She sat with the quiet dignity that seemed inherent to Apache women, yet there was something in her bearing that spoke of authority beyond her apparent years. Ayana, they called her. The name meant eternal blossom, though McKenna doubted she knew he understood enough Apache to translate it. She was perhaps 25, with the kind of beauty that revealed itself slowly, like dawn creeping across the desert. Her long black hair was braided with beads and small silver ornaments that caught the firelight, and her dress, while traditional, showed the practical modifications of a woman who expected to ride hard and fight harder if necessary. McKenna had encountered Apache women before, usually at a distance measured in rifle shots. He knew them to be as fierce as their men, as devoted to their children, as willing to die for their freedom. But Ayana was different in ways he could not yet articulate. When she spoke, both Nate and the medicine man listened with a respect that had nothing to do with mere courtesy. When she was silent, her presence seemed to fill the space around her like heat from a well-tended fire. He had been watching her for 3 days now, ever since this unlikely gathering had been arranged through intermediaries and old treaties written in languages that respected honor above expedience. Not watching in the way a man watches a beautiful woman, though she was undeniably that. Rather, he found himself studying her the way he might study a particularly complex piece of country, trying to understand its hidden dangers and unexpected resources. She, in turn, had been watching him. The first time their eyes met across the camp, McKenna felt something stir in the careful emptiness he had cultivated for so long. It was not attraction, exactly, though that was certainly present. It was recognition of a kind he had never experienced. Like seeing his own reflection in water, but changed, as if the water showed him not who he was, but who he might become. He dismissed the feeling as the product of too much desert sun and too little sleep. He was here as hired security for the territorial representatives, nothing more. His job was to keep them alive long enough to either make peace or fail honorably in the attempt. What an Apache woman thought of him was as relevant to his duties as the phase of the moon. But, as the negotiations dragged through their third day, he found his attention returning to her again and again. The way she held herself during the formal speeches. The subtle gestures she used to communicate with her companions when she thought the white men were not observing. The moment of pure, unguarded laughter when one of the young Apache children had stumbled while showing off for the visitors, and she had scooped the boy up with a tenderness that made McKenna's chest tighten with memory. On the evening of the third day, as the formal talks concluded for another 24 hours without meaningful progress, McKenna found himself walking the perimeter of the camp. It was a habit born of years when inattention meant death, but tonight it felt more like an escape from thoughts that had no place in his carefully ordered existence. The desert at twilight was a cathedral of silence and shadow. The mountains rose like the spines of sleeping giants, and, somewhere in the distance, a coyote offered its lonely song to the emerging stars. McKenna had always found peace in such moments, when the vastness of the land put human struggles into their proper perspective. Tonight, however, peace eluded him. "You walk like a man carrying a great weight," said a voice behind him. He turned, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm before stopping as he recognized Ayanna. She stood perhaps 10 feet away, having approached with the silent grace that seemed natural to her people. In the dying light, she looked like something out of legend, as if the desert itself had taken human form to speak with him. "Most weight gets easier to carry with practice," he replied, surprised by his own willingness to engage in conversation. He was not a man given to philosophical discussions with strangers, particularly strangers who represented everything his world had taught him to distrust. She stepped closer, and he caught the scent of sage and something else, something that might have been cedar smoke or might have been the indefinable essence that clung to those who lived in harmony with wild places. "Some weight is not meant to be carried alone," she said. "The Apache know this. Perhaps the white man has forgotten." McKenna studied her face in the fading light, searching for the mockery or pity he had learned to expect when people presumed to understand his burdens. He found neither. Instead, there was a simple acceptance that somehow managed to be more unsettling than any judgment might have been. "The Apache know many things," he admitted. "But they also know that some lessons can only be learned in solitude." Ayanna smiled then, an expression that transformed her entire face and made McKenna understand why her people might have given her a name that spoke of eternal blossoming. "You speak our language," she said, "and it was not a question. Some of it. Enough to know that names have power, and that yours was chosen by people who saw something in you that endures." "And what do your people call you, Ghost Walker?" The Apache name startled him. He had heard it whispered in their camps when he thought no one was paying attention to the white scout who appeared and disappeared like morning mist. "Thomas McKenna. Just a name. Nothing more. Names are never just names. Thomas means twin, does it not? And McKenna speaks of fire. So you are the twin born of fire. But which twin, I wonder? The one who destroys, or the one who brings warmth to those who are cold?" McKenna felt something crack inside him, some small section of the wall he had built around his heart. The question was too close to thoughts he had been avoiding, too near to the choice between emptiness and feeling that he faced every morning when he opened his eyes to another day of careful survival. "I think," he said slowly, "that depends on who is asking." They stood in silence for a moment, the desert night settling around them like a familiar embrace. Somewhere in the distance, one of the Apache children laughed, the sound carrying across the camp like an echo of innocence in a world that had forgotten what innocence looked like. "Tomorrow," Ayanna said, "there will be a ceremony. A choosing. It is our way when treaties are made and new paths must be taken. The men will speak of boundaries and obligations, of what can be given and what must be kept. But choices of the heart follow their own laws." McKenna felt the weight of unspoken meaning in her words, but before he could respond, she had already begun to fade back into the shadows with the same silent grace that had brought her to him. He stood alone under the vast canopy of stars, wondering what kind of choosing could possibly matter in a world where Apache and white men struggled simply to share the same sky without bloodshed. That night, for the first time in years, his dreams were not haunted by the ghosts of his past failures. Instead, he found himself walking through landscapes that seemed to exist outside of time, places where the desert bloomed with flowers that never faded and where the weight he carried had somehow become lighter without being abandoned entirely. When he woke before dawn, as was his habit, McKenna felt as if he stood at the edge of a precipice he had not known existed. Below him lay the familiar territory of careful isolation and emotional numbness that had served him for so long. But, for the first time in 13 years, he found himself wondering what might lie beyond that edge, in the unknown country that could only be reached by taking a leap he was not sure he possessed the courage to attempt. The fourth day of negotiations began with an unexpected formality. Rather than gathering around the crude table that had served for the previous discussions, the Apache had arranged themselves in a traditional circle, with Nate and the medicine man taking positions that clearly indicated this would be more than another exchange of impossible demands and inadequate offers. Colonel Morrison, clearly uncomfortable with any deviation from military protocol, nevertheless took his place in the circle with as much dignity as his nature allowed. His aide, looking as if he expected to be scalped at any moment, clutched his notebook like a talisman against the unknown. McKenna positioned himself where duty demanded, close enough to intervene if the peace talks turned violent, far enough away to avoid becoming part of whatever ceremony the Apache had planned. But, as the morning progressed, he began to realize that his careful positioning meant nothing. This was not about the white man's negotiations or the Apache's treaty obligations. This was about something far more personal and infinitely more dangerous to the equilibrium he had spent years perfecting. Ayana entered the circle wearing traditional ceremonial dress that marked her as more than just another member of the tribal delegation. The intricate beadwork and silver ornaments spoke of status and responsibility within her people, and the way she moved suggested this ceremony held significance that transcended the political necessities that had brought their two peoples together. She carried herself with the dignity of a woman about to make a choice that would echo through generations, and, when she spoke, her voice carried across the desert silence with the clarity of water over stone. In the time of our grandfathers' grandfathers, she began, when the world was younger and the barriers between peoples had not yet hardened into hatred, there were ceremonies of choosing that honored the wisdom of the heart above the demands of circumstance. Today, with both our peoples standing at the edge of a new path, I invoke the old ways and claim the right of choice that belongs to those who have proven their wisdom and counsel and their courage in the face of the unknown. Nate nodded slowly, his weathered features revealing both understanding and resignation. Ayana, daughter of chiefs, keeper of the old wisdom, what choice would you make known to all who gather in this sacred circle? She turned then, her dark eyes scanning the assembled group until they came to rest on McKenna. The silence stretched between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, and he felt the weight of every gaze in the circle settling on him with the intensity of focused sunlight. Among the white men, she said, her voice carrying a certainty that seemed to draw its power from sources deeper than individual will, there is one who walks between worlds without belonging fully to either. One who has chosen strength through separation, wisdom through solitude, survival through the careful destruction of everything that might make him vulnerable to the cruelties of this world. McKenna felt his breath catch in his chest. The description was too accurate, too precise in its understanding of the path he had chosen. He wanted to speak, to protest, to somehow deflect the attention that was focusing on him with the inexorable force of a gathering storm. But Ayana was not finished, and something in her bearing commanded silence from every soul within the circle. This man, she continued, has made himself into a weapon against suffering by refusing to allow anything into his heart that suffering might destroy. He believes this makes him strong, and, in many ways, he is not wrong. But there is another kind of strength, one that our people have always known but which the white world seems to have forgotten. It is the strength that comes not from emptying the heart, but from filling it so completely with worthy things that there is no room left for fear. She stepped toward him then, moving with the deliberate grace of someone performing a ritual that had been rehearsed not in action but in the deep places of the soul where true decisions are made. McKenna found himself unable to move, unable to think of anything except the growing certainty that his entire life had been leading toward this moment, this choice, this woman who seemed to see through all his carefully constructed defenses to the man he had once been and might yet become again. Thomas McKenna, she said, and her voice carried the formality of ancient ceremony while somehow remaining intimately personal. I have watched you for 3 days and seen what others have missed. You are a man who has survived by making himself into nothing that can be taken away. But I am Apache, and we do not fear the taking away of things. We fear only the failure to live fully while we have the chance. The silence that followed her words was so complete that McKenna could hear his own heartbeat and the whisper of wind through sagebrush 50 yards away. Every face in the circle was turned toward them, but he was aware only of Ayana's eyes and the impossible choice she was offering him. By the laws of my people and the authority given to me by blood and wisdom, I choose you as my husband, she said, the words falling into the desert silence like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock and possibility in every direction. Not because you are safe, but because you are not. Not because you offer easy happiness, but because you offer the chance for something greater than happiness. The chance for two people to become more together than either could ever be alone. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Colonel Morrison half rose from his position, his military mind clearly struggling to process how a treaty negotiation had suddenly become a marriage proposal. His aide looked as if he were witnessing the end of civilization as he understood it. Even Nate appeared surprised, though there was something in his expression that suggested he was not entirely unprepared for this development. But it was McKenna's response that would determine whether this moment became a brief interruption in the serious business of politics and territory, or something that changed the course of multiple lives forever. He stood slowly, feeling as if he were moving through water or dream, and, for the first time in 13 years, allowed himself to truly see the woman before him. Not as an Apache, not as a representative of a people his world considered enemies, not as a beautiful distraction from the serious business of survival. He saw her as Ayana, eternal blossom, a woman of courage and wisdom who was offering him something he had convinced himself no longer existed, the chance to be whole again. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice carried across the circle with a steadiness that surprised him, "I believe you have mistaken me for someone who might be worthy of such an honor." The response sent a murmur through the gathered Apache, and McKenna realized that his answer would be interpreted as either acceptance or rejection, with no middle ground available. The old ways Ayana had invoked did not allow for the careful negotiations and qualified commitments that marked the white man's approach to serious decisions. Ayana stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes and the slight tremor in her hands that revealed this ceremony was costing her more courage than her bearing suggested. "Worthiness," she said softly, "is not a fixed thing, Thomas McKenna. It is not something a man possesses or lacks like the color of his eyes or the strength of his hands. Worthiness is something that grows between people when they choose to see in each other not what is, but what could be." McKenna felt the walls he had built around his heart beginning to crumble, not from external assault but from the growing pressure of hope he had thought permanently destroyed. For 13 years, he had defined himself by his losses, his failures, his refusal to risk caring about anything that could be taken away. But, standing here in the desert morning, facing a woman who somehow understood that strength could mean choice rather than surrender, he began to remember who he had been before grief had carved him into someone who merely survived. "I am not," he said slowly, "the man I was when this day began." "None of us are," Ayana replied. "That is what makes this moment sacred. That is what makes choice possible." McKenna looked around the circle one more time, taking in the faces of men who represented two worlds that had been trying to destroy each other for longer than most of them could remember. Colonel Morrison still looked as if he were witnessing the collapse of military protocol. Nate watched with the patience of a man who understood that some decisions could not be hurried. The medicine man's weathered features revealed nothing, but McKenna sensed approval in his stillness. Then, he looked back at Ayana and made the choice that would define the rest of his life. "In that case," he said, reaching out to take her hands in his own, "I accept." The shock that rippled through the circle was like lightning striking dry timber. Colonel Morrison's face had gone the color of old leather, and his aide's pencil snapped in his trembling grip. The carefully orchestrated dignity of the treaty negotiations dissolved into chaos as the implications of what had just occurred began to settle over the assembled group like dust after an explosion. "This is highly irregular," Morrison sputtered, rising to his full height with the indignation of a man whose understanding of proper procedure had just been trampled by forces beyond his comprehension. "Mr. McKenna, you are here in an official capacity as security for this delegation. You cannot simply, that is to say, the territorial government has not authorized." "The territorial government," Nate interrupted with quiet authority, "has no say in matters of the heart. This ceremony follows the old laws, older than your government, older than the borders you have drawn across our lands. What has been chosen here today is witnessed by the desert and the sky, and no power of man can undo what the spirits have blessed. McKenna felt the truth of those words settling into his bones even as his rational mind struggled to process what he had just committed himself to. An hour ago, he had been a hired gun with no attachments and no obligations beyond his contract. Now he stood hand in hand with an Apache woman in what appeared to be a marriage ceremony conducted according to laws he barely understood, with consequences that stretched far beyond his ability to predict or control. The part of him that had survived 13 years by avoiding exactly this kind of emotional entanglement screamed warnings about the magnitude of his mistake. He was throwing away everything he had learned about the necessity of staying unattached, uncommitted, free to walk away when situations became untenable. He was violating every principle that had kept him alive and functional in a world where caring about anything too deeply was an invitation to suffering. But another part of him, a part that had been buried so long he had almost forgotten its existence, felt as if it were breathing freely for the first time in over a decade. Standing here with Ayana's hands in his, feeling the weight of ancient ceremony settling around them like a blessing, he realized that survival and living were not the same thing. He had become an expert at the first while forgetting entirely about the second. The Apache way, Ayana said, her voice carrying clearly in the shocked silence, recognizes that true strength comes not from what a person can endure alone, but from what two people can build together. The choosing ceremony is not just about joining two lives. It is about creating something new that serves both the individuals and the people they will serve together. She turned to address the circle as a whole, though her hands remained firmly clasped in McKenna's, as if she understood that any physical separation might break the spell that was binding this impossible moment together. In the old days, when such choosings were made, there would be trials to test whether the choice was wise. Not trials of combat or skill, but trials of the heart and spirit. Tests to reveal whether two people could indeed become stronger together than either could be alone. The medicine man rose slowly, his weathered features thoughtful as he studied the joined couple before him. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades spent mediating between the world of spirits and the world of flesh and blood politics. The woman speaks truly of the old ways. But these are not the old days, and the paths before us lead through territory that our ancestors never had to navigate. If this choosing is to be honored, it must prove itself not only according to Apache law, but according to the realities of a world where Apache and white men struggle to share the same sky without bloodshed. He gestured toward Morrison and his aide, both of whom were still struggling to process this unexpected development in what should have been a straightforward diplomatic meeting. The white man's government will not recognize this union unless it serves their purposes. The Apache councils will question whether a warrior of the people should bind herself to one who has spent his life serving those who would drive us from our lands. And both peoples will watch to see whether this choosing brings wisdom or disaster to the greater negotiations that must continue regardless of what the heart demands. McKenna felt the weight of impossible expectations settling on his shoulders like a mantle made of lead. It was one thing to make a personal choice in the privacy of his own heart. It was another entirely to realize that his decision to accept Ayana's proposal had suddenly transformed him into a symbol whose actions would be interpreted as representing the possibilities and dangers inherent in any cooperation between two peoples who had been enemies for longer than most of them could remember. Perhaps, he said slowly, his voice carrying across the circle with a steadiness that surprised him, that is exactly why this choice had to be made. Not in spite of the difficulties, but because of them. He looked at Ayana, seeing in her dark eyes both the courage that had led her to make such a public declaration and the uncertainty about what his acceptance would actually mean for both of their futures. You said the Apache know that some weight is not meant to be carried alone. Maybe what we're facing here is bigger than what either of our peoples can handle in isolation. Explain, Nate commanded, though there was curiosity rather than hostility in his tone. McKenna released one of Ayana's hands but kept hold of the other, using the contact as an anchor while he tried to put into words thoughts that were still forming in his mind. For 13 years, I've survived by refusing to be vulnerable to anything or anyone. I made myself into a weapon against suffering by eliminating everything that suffering could use against me. It worked, after a fashion. I stayed alive. I stayed functional. But I also stayed empty. He gestured toward the assembled group, taking in both the Apache leaders and the territorial representatives who were watching this unexpected development with varying degrees of alarm and fascination. Seems to me that both our peoples have been doing something similar. The Apache have withdrawn into the mountains, refusing to trust any white man's promise because they've been betrayed too many times. The whites have decided that the only good Indian is a dead Indian because they're too afraid to try to understand people they can't control. Colonel Morrison opened his mouth to protest this characterization, but McKenna continued before the interruption could take hold. Both sides have made themselves into weapons against the pain of hoping for something better. And maybe that's why we're still fighting the same war our grandfathers were fighting, with the same results. Maybe the only way to break the pattern is for someone to be willing to risk being vulnerable again. Ayanna squeezed his hand, and he felt strength flowing between them that was different from anything he had ever experienced. Not the brittle strength of isolation and self-sufficiency, but something more resilient because it was shared. The choosing ceremony, she said, has always been about more than individual happiness. It is about creating partnerships that serve the larger good. In the old days, such unions often bridged different bands or tribes, creating alliances that made all the people stronger. And, you believe, the medicine man said slowly, that a union between Apache and white man could serve a similar purpose in these times? I believe, Ayanna replied, that we will never know unless someone is willing to try. The silence that followed was different from the shocked stillness that had greeted the original proposal. This was the quiet of people thinking hard about possibilities they had never seriously considered, weighing the potential benefits against the obvious risks. It was Colonel Morrison who finally broke the silence, though when he spoke, his voice had lost much of its military bluster and carried instead the tone of a man who was genuinely trying to understand something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the proper order of things. Miss, that is, ma'am. I'm not certain what authority I might have in this situation, but I feel compelled to point out that marriage between whites and Indians is, well, it's not precisely illegal, but it's certainly not common, and the social complications alone. The social complications, McKenna interrupted, exist whether we acknowledge this union or not. The question is whether we're going to try to solve them or just keep pretending they don't exist until they explode into another war. He looked around the circle again, seeing in the faces of both peoples the same mixture of hope and fear that he felt in his own heart. You want to know what shocked me most about Ayanna's proposal? Not that she made it. Apache women are known for their courage. What shocked me was that it made me realize I've been living like a dead man for 13 years, and I didn't even know it. The man who destroys his weak self, Ayanna said softly, can never be destroyed by others. But, Thomas, you didn't destroy your weak self. You destroyed your living self. There's a difference. The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow, because she was absolutely right. In his determination to eliminate vulnerability, he had eliminated everything that made life worth living. He had confused strength with numbness, wisdom with withdrawal, survival with merely breathing. The weak self he thought he had destroyed had actually been the part of him capable of connection, growth, joy, hope. Everything that made endurance worthwhile. So what do you propose? Nate asked. How does this choosing serve the larger purposes that brought us all together? It was Ayanna who answered, though McKenna could feel in the pressure of her hand that she was drawing strength from their connection just as he was drawing strength from hers. The Apache way has always been to test new possibilities before committing the whole people to a path that might lead to destruction. Let this union be such a test. Let Thomas learn our ways while remaining connected to his people. Let me learn to navigate the white man's world without abandoning the wisdom of my own. If we can build something good together, something that honors both our heritages while creating something new, then perhaps our peoples can learn to do the same. And, if you cannot, the medicine man asked gently. Then, at least we will fail honestly, McKenna said, instead of failing because we were too afraid to try. The negotiations that followed were unlike anything that had ever been attempted in the history of Apache-white relations. What had begun as a standard treaty discussion evolved into something far more complex, an agreement that would allow McKenna and Ayanna to live as husband and wife while serving as unofficial ambassadors between their respective peoples. The details were hammered out over 3 days of intense discussion that tested everyone's creativity and patience. McKenna would retain his position as security for the territorial representatives, but he would also spend significant time learning Apache customs and language. Ayanna would maintain her status within her own people while also studying the white man's laws and social customs. Together, they would serve as translators not just of language, but of culture and intention. It was an arrangement that satisfied no one completely and everyone partially, which Colonel Morrison declared to be the hallmark of effective diplomacy. The Apache leadership agreed to the experiment with the understanding that it could be ended if it proved harmful to tribal interests. The territorial government approved the arrangement with similar reservations and the additional stipulation that detailed reports be filed on all cultural exchanges and observations. Through it all, McKenna found himself watching Ayanna with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. She navigated the complex negotiations with a skill that spoke of years spent mediating between different factions within her own people. She understood instinctively how to present ideas in ways that addressed the concerns of each party without compromising the essential integrity of what they were trying to accomplish. More importantly, she seemed to possess an unshakable faith that what they were attempting would somehow work out for the best. Not because it would be easy, but because they would approach it with honesty and good intentions. It was a kind of optimism that McKenna had forgotten was possible, the confidence that came not from believing nothing could go wrong, but from believing that people of goodwill could handle whatever went wrong without destroying everything they were trying to build. When the formal agreements were finally signed and witnessed, McKenna found himself standing once again at the edge of a precipice, but this time he was not alone. Ayanna stood beside him, her hand in his, both of them looking out over a landscape that had suddenly become full of possibilities neither of them could have imagined a week earlier. "Are you frightened?" she asked softly, her voice carrying only to him despite the celebration beginning around them as both sides recognized that something historic had just been accomplished. "Terrified," he admitted. "But it's a different kind of fear than I'm used to. For the first time in 13 years, I'm not afraid of losing something. I'm afraid of not being worthy of what I've been given." "That," she said with a smile that seemed to capture all the warmth of the desert sun, "is exactly the right kind of fear to have. It will keep us both honest." As the sun set over the Chiricahua Mountains on their wedding day, Thomas McKenna realized that he had spent 13 years preparing for this moment without knowing it. Every lesson in survival, every moment of hard-earned wisdom, every skill acquired through necessity and pain had been building toward the moment when he would be strong enough not to stand alone, but to stand with someone whose own strength complemented and completed his own. The man who had entered this desert clearing a week ago had been a weapon forged by loss and sharpened by solitude. The man who would leave it tomorrow was something entirely different, a partner in an enterprise that might change the course of history, or might simply prove that love could exist even in the spaces between worlds that seemed determined to remain forever separate. Either way, he was no longer alone with his burdens. And, for the first time in 13 years, he was no longer afraid of tomorrow. 6 months later, Thomas McKenna stood on the porch of the small adobe house he and Ayanna had built together in the neutral zone between the Apache reservation and the territorial settlements. The dwelling itself was a testament to their union, constructed with Apache techniques for desert survival but modified with white man's innovations for comfort and durability. Like their marriage, it represented something entirely new, neither fully Apache nor fully white, but stronger than either tradition alone could have produced. The house sat in a valley that had been chosen carefully, visible from both communities but belonging fully to neither. It was here that the most difficult part of their experiment had begun, not the ceremony or the negotiations, but the daily work of learning to live as one while honoring the two worlds they represented. McKenna had discovered that marrying Ayanna was like learning to speak a new language that had no words for many of the concepts he had spent his adult life believing were universal truths. The Apache understanding of time, for instance, was so different from the white man's rigid schedules that their first months together had been marked by constant misunderstandings about when things should happen and how long they should take. More challenging still was learning to navigate the emotional landscape of a people who viewed vulnerability not as weakness to be eliminated, but as a form of honesty that strengthened relationships by allowing others to offer support when it was needed. For a man who had spent 13 years perfecting the art of needing nothing from anyone, this represented a fundamental rewiring of his entire approach to existence. But the most profound change had come from witnessing how Ayanna approached the inevitable conflicts and difficulties that arose between them. Where McKenna's instinct was to withdraw, to protect himself by creating distance, Ayanna moved closer. When disagreements arose, she treated them not as threats to their relationship but as opportunities to understand each other more deeply. The first time they had argued seriously, over something as mundane as how to allocate their limited water supply during a particularly dry spell, McKenna had felt the old familiar urge to pack his belongings and disappear before the situation could escalate to real damage. Instead, he had forced himself to stay, to engage, to trust that conflict could be survived without destroying everything worth preserving. What he discovered was that Ayanna fought with the same intensity she brought to everything else, but her goal was never to win at his expense. Rather, she seemed determined to find solutions that honored both their needs while strengthening their ability to face future challenges together. It was a form of warfare he had never encountered, one where victory belonged to both participants or to neither. Today, however, their personal struggles seemed small compared to the larger test their union was facing. Word had reached them 2 days earlier that a band of renegade Apache, led by a war chief who rejected any accommodation with the white settlers, had raided a ranch 30 miles south of their valley. 3 families had been killed, including children, and the territorial militia was mobilizing for what threatened to become another full-scale war. Governor Safford himself was riding to their valley, along with representatives from the Apache Tribal Council. The experiment that had begun with such hope 6 months earlier was about to face its greatest test. Could the bridge they had built between two peoples survive when those peoples were once again spilling each other's blood? McKenna heard the sound of approaching horses and turned to see a dust cloud rising from the direction of Tucson. The territorial delegation was arriving precisely on schedule, their military precision a stark contrast to the Apache approach to such meetings. Ayanna's people would arrive when they arrived, having traveled at a pace determined by the needs of their horses and the rhythms of the desert rather than any arbitrary deadline imposed by white man's clocks. "They come in anger," Ayanna said, stepping out of the house to stand beside him. Even after 6 months of marriage, her ability to appear silently still caught him off guard, though he had learned to appreciate the grace with which she moved through the world. "Can you blame them?" McKenna asked. "Dead children tend to have that effect on people." "No, I do not blame them. But anger will not bring back the dead, and it will create more dead if we allow it to control this meeting." She was wearing the formal dress that marked her status as a peace negotiator, but McKenna could see the tension in her shoulders that spoke of her own struggle with the situation. The raiders who had attacked the ranch were led by her cousin, a man who had once been considered for leadership of the entire Apache Confederation before his rejection of all cooperation with whites had cost him political support. The personal dimension of the crisis made everything more complicated. Ayanna's loyalty to her family was absolute, but so was her commitment to the peace they had been working to build. McKenna understood better than most the agony of being caught between competing obligations, each of which carried moral weight that could not be simply dismissed. Governor Safford's party came into view as they crested the ridge that marked the entrance to the valley. Even at a distance, McKenna could read the body language of men who had come prepared for war and were looking for any excuse to unleash it. The governor himself rode at the head of the column, his face set in the grim lines that had made him famous for his uncompromising stance against Apache raids. Behind him rode Colonel Morrison, who had become something of an unofficial liaison for these monthly meetings between the territorial government and the Apache leadership. Morrison had evolved considerably over the 6 months since the original treaty negotiations, learning to work with Apache customs rather than against them. But even his newfound cultural sensitivity would be tested by the current crisis. The territorial militia brought up the rear, 40 men armed and ready for combat. Their presence was both a show of force and a practical necessity in a territory where the line between diplomacy and warfare could disappear without warning. McKenna recognized several of the soldiers from his own days as a territorial scout, men who had learned their trade in conflicts where mercy was a luxury few could afford. "Thomas," Ayanna said quietly, "whatever happens today, remember that the work we have been doing here is larger than any single crisis. There will be those who want to use this attack as proof that Apache and white man cannot live in peace. Do not let them succeed in that." He took her hand, feeling the strength that flowed between them even in moments of greatest uncertainty. "And if they're right? If this experiment of ours has been nothing more than wishful thinking in a world that's too broken to be fixed? Then, we will have failed honorably," she replied, echoing the words he had spoken months earlier in the original treaty circle. "But I do not believe we have failed. What we have built here proves that Apache and white man can find ways to understand each other. The question is whether our peoples have the courage to follow where we have led." The governor's party reached the house and dismounted with military efficiency. Safford himself was a man who carried authority like a well-fitted coat, comfortable with command but wise enough to recognize when he was operating outside his area of expertise. His weathered face showed the strain of a man who had spent the last 2 days trying to prevent a crisis from exploding into wholesale slaughter. "Mr. McKenna, Mrs. McKenna," he said, using the formal address that had been negotiated as part of the original treaty arrangements. The territorial government had agreed to recognize their Apache-style marriage as legally binding, while the Apache had agreed to acknowledge McKenna's continuing obligations to his own people. "Governor," McKenna replied. "I assume this isn't a social visit." "I'm afraid not. I suppose you've heard about the raid on the Henderson Ranch?" "We have," Ayanna answered before McKenna could respond. "And we share your grief for the innocent lives that were lost. The taking of children is forbidden by Apache law as well as white man's law." "Yet it was Apache who did the taking," Safford replied, though his tone was more weary than accusatory. "Apache who have rejected the authority of the tribal council," Ayanna clarified. "Apache who follow leaders the people have cast out for their refusal to honor the treaties we have made." It was a crucial distinction, one that could mean the difference between a targeted response against specific raiders and a general war against all Apache. But McKenna could see in the governor's expression the political pressures that were pushing him toward the broader conflict. Dead settlers demanded vengeance, and voters rarely concerned themselves with the fine distinctions between different Apache factions. "The problem," Colonel Morrison interjected, "is that the territorial militia doesn't see much difference between renegade Apache and treaty Apache when they're burying children. They want blood, and they're not particularly concerned about whose blood they spill as long as it's Apache blood." The brutal honesty of Morrison's assessment hung in the desert air like smoke from a distant fire. This was the reality that no amount of goodwill or cultural understanding could change. When people were afraid and angry, they stopped making careful distinctions between enemies and potential allies. "How long do we have?" McKenna asked. "Before the militia takes matters into its own hands?" "Maybe a week, if we're lucky. The territorial legislature is meeting in emergency session, and there are already calls for the complete abrogation of all treaties with the Apache. If we can't produce results quickly, I won't be able to prevent a general war." A second dust cloud was approaching from the opposite direction, marking the arrival of the Apache delegation. McKenna watched as Nate led his party into the valley, accompanied by the medicine man and 3 other tribal leaders whose presence indicated the seriousness with which the Apache were treating this crisis. The arrival of both delegations at the same time created a tension that seemed to make the very air vibrate with possibility and danger. McKenna found himself thinking of gunpowder and sparks, of how the smallest misstep could ignite an explosion that would consume everything they had worked to build. "Before we begin formal talks," Ayanna said, addressing both groups simultaneously, "Thomas and I would like to share something we have learned during our months of living between worlds." She gestured toward their house, its unique architecture serving as a visible symbol of what could be accomplished when different traditions were combined rather than allowed to compete. "When we first came together, we each brought our own ways of doing things, our own understanding of how problems should be solved. We discovered that most of our conflicts came not from bad intentions, but from assuming that our way was the only right way." McKenna picked up the thread of her thought, understanding instinctively where she was leading. The Apache way teaches that some problems can only be solved by the whole community working together. The white man's way emphasizes individual responsibility and direct action. Both approaches have wisdom, but neither alone is sufficient for the challenges we face today. "What are you proposing?" Nate asked, though his tone suggested he had already guessed the direction of their thoughts. "A joint expedition," McKenna said. "Apache trackers and territorial militia working together to find and stop the raiders before they can strike again. Not a white man's operation with Apache scouts, and not an Apache operation with white observers. A true partnership where both peoples take equal responsibility for protecting all the innocent lives in this territory." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the sagebrush and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. McKenna could feel the weight of history settling around them as two peoples who had been enemies for generations contemplated the possibility of becoming something unprecedented, true allies. It was Governor Safford who spoke first, his voice careful and measured as if he understood that his next words might determine whether the Arizona Territory descended into war or discovered a new path toward peace. The political risks of such an arrangement would be enormous. If anything went wrong, if there were casualties on either side, the public reaction could destroy both our administrations. And if we continue as we have been, the medicine man replied, with Apache hunting Apache while white men prepare for war, what then? How many more children will die while we protect ourselves from political risks? The raiders know this country better than any territorial soldier, Nate added. They know every canyon, every water source, every place where an ambush might succeed. Our trackers know these things too, but they cannot pursue renegade Apache without being accused of protecting their own people at the expense of white settlers. While your militia, Ayanna continued, has the weapons and training to face the raiders in open combat, but lacks the knowledge of how to find them in country that can swallow an army without a trace. McKenna felt the familiar sensation of pieces clicking into place, the same intuitive understanding that had served him well during his years as a scout and tracker. The solution was obvious once stated clearly, but it required all parties to abandon their comfortable assumptions about how such problems should be addressed. There's another advantage, he said slowly, working through the implications as he spoke. A joint operation would make it clear to everyone, Apache and white alike, that this isn't about one people hunting another. It's about all of us protecting our shared home from those who would destroy the peace we've worked to build. The negotiations that followed were intense and complex, requiring 3 days of detailed planning to work out the practical arrangements for an unprecedented cooperation between two military traditions that had never attempted to function as a unified force. But, by the end of the week, an extraordinary expedition had been assembled. 20 Apache warriors, chosen for their tracking skills and knowledge of the country, rode alongside 30 territorial militiamen selected for their discipline and ability to follow orders even when those orders came from officers whose skin was the wrong color. McKenna and Ayanna served as joint commanders, their unique understanding of both cultures making them the only people capable of translating not just language but the deeper assumptions that guided each group's approach to warfare. The pursuit of the raiders took them deep into the Dragoon Mountains, through country so rough that only the Apache trackers could have followed the trail. For 5 days, the joint expedition pushed through terrain that tested both the endurance of the white soldiers and the patience of the Apache warriors, who were accustomed to moving at their own pace according to the rhythms of the desert. But something remarkable happened during those 5 days. The shared hardship and common purpose began to break down the barriers of suspicion and mistrust that had kept the two peoples apart for so long. Apache warriors shared their knowledge of desert survival with soldiers who were struggling with the heat and rough terrain. White troopers offered their medical supplies and additional firepower when the Apache scouts were injured by the unforgiving landscape. By the time they finally cornered the raiders in a box canyon near the Mexican border, the expedition had become something more than either people had thought possible, a true integration of different traditions and abilities in service of a common goal. The final confrontation lasted less than an hour. The raiders, led by Ayanna's cousin, had expected pursuit from either Apache or white forces, but not from both working together. Their carefully planned escape routes had been anticipated by Apache knowledge and blocked by white firepower. When surrender became their only option, they yielded not to enemies but to representatives of their own people working in partnership with former foes. The aftermath of the successful operation marked a turning point in Apache-white relations that would be felt for generations. The joint expedition had proven that cooperation was not only possible but more effective than either people could achieve alone. More importantly, it had demonstrated that peace was not simply the absence of war, but the presence of active collaboration in protecting the things both peoples valued. McKenna and Ayanna returned to their valley as heroes to both communities, but also as symbols of a new possibility that had been tested under the most difficult circumstances and proven viable. The house they had built together became a gathering place where representatives of both peoples came to learn the arts of translation and cooperation that were essential for maintaining the fragile peace they had helped create. Years later, when historians would write about the Arizona Territory's transition from warfare to coexistence, they would mark the raid on the Henderson Ranch and the joint expedition that followed as the moment when two peoples learned that their strength lay not in their ability to fight each other, but in their willingness to fight together for the future they both wanted to build. But, for Thomas McKenna, standing on the porch of his adobe home as the sun set over the Chiricahua Mountains, the true victory was more personal and infinitely more precious. He had finally understood the difference between destroying his weak self and transforming it. The man who had once believed that strength meant standing alone had discovered that the greatest strength of all lay in choosing to stand with someone whose courage matched your own. Ayana emerged from the house, carrying their infant son in her arms. The child was a living symbol of what could be accomplished when two worlds came together, not in conquest but in love. His existence proved that the barriers between peoples were not insurmountable natural laws, but human constructions that could be overcome by human choice. "What are you thinking about?" Ayana asked, settling beside him on the bench they had carved together from a fallen cottonwood tree. "About how wrong I was," McKenna replied, reaching out to touch his son's dark hair. "I spent 13 years believing that the only way to protect myself from pain was to stop caring about anything worth protecting. But the truth is exactly the opposite. Which is that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, but only if he understands that weakness and strength aren't opposites. They're partners. The courage to be vulnerable is what makes real strength possible." Ayana smiled, the expression that had first shown him there were possibilities in the world beyond mere survival. "My wise husband has learned the most important lesson of all. Which is that some things are worth the risk of losing everything for. And that when two people are willing to take that risk together, they create something that can never truly be destroyed, no matter what the world might take away." As the stars emerged in the vast desert sky above them, Thomas McKenna held his wife and son close and understood that he had finally become the man he was always meant to be, not invulnerable, but unafraid. Not unbreakable, but willing to rebuild as many times as necessary. Not alone, but part of something larger than himself. The man who had once walked between worlds without belonging to either had finally found his place, not in one world or the other, but in the space between them, where new possibilities could take root and grow into something that honored the past while reaching toward a future that neither people could have achieved alone. In learning to love without reservation, he had discovered that true strength was not about what a person could endure in solitude, but about what two people could accomplish together when they chose to trust each other with their deepest vulnerabilities and highest hopes. The weak self he had tried so hard to destroy had not been weak at all, but simply human. And, being fully human, he now understood, was the greatest strength of all.